Hello, my name is Duncan Green, and this is the LSE's series of videos on different aspects of influencing. In this video, I want to talk about community organizing. It's a very specific approach to building power, organizing, influencing from the grassroots. And I want to explain the essentials of community organizing and how it differs from other sorts of activism. The most essential principle in community organizing is that it's all about building power at community level. Everything else you do is secondary to this core idea of building power. And it's built, not given. You don't transfer power, you help people acquire it through struggle and through reflection. In that building power, campaign victories are just a means to an end. It's not about winning this ask or getting that policy approved or that decision from government or whatever it is. These are all means to the overall end, which is building power. Another key aspect is leadership. The gurus are the great writers and thinkers on community organization, people like Saul Alinsky, Ella Baker, Paulo Freire, Marshall Gantz, argue that those most affected must lead, and that leadership and continuously developing new waves of leadership is the core activity of the organizer. The organizer is often the person at the back of the room. The people who are at the front of the room, leading the conversation, leading the confrontation when it's needed, will be the leaders who the organizers have helped train and bring on and support. In all of this, both for the organizers and the leaders, it's all about relationships. Relationships are, and emotional intelligence around relationships, endlessly building relationships are absolutely critical for organizers in their work. But it's not always nice. Sometimes there is conflict, and conflict may well be necessary. So you have to be willing to have a hard time and give other people a hard time in order to achieve the change you seek. The field of community organizing sits on a huge range of historical influences and precedents. I sometimes get a little confused, I must say, on where the history of struggle and social movements ends and modern community organizing begins, but certainly community organizers and some of these great writers I've mentioned draw on things like the decolonization struggles of the 20th century, people like Gandhi in the Indian independence movement, but also on class struggles, on the work of labor movements and trade unions, or of land movements like the landless workers movement in Brazil, or going right back to the levelers in the UK. The iconic case study, which comes up again and again and is a kind of touchstone for community organizers, is the US civil rights movement. It has everything. It has some superb books to read. I really repay study. But also other iconic cases like the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, women's suffrage movements around the world and women's rights movement, the Chartists movement in the UK for political rights. There's huge amounts that can be learned from all of these great campaigns of the past. One of the distinctive features of a lot of community organizing is how seriously it takes and incorporates faith. A lot of activism is quite secular, quite skeptical, suspicious of faith. Not so community organizing. Community organizing often builds on the faith institutions that exist out there, arguing in part that those are the institutions that are most relevant to the lives and feelings and motivations of poor communities. So if you look, for example, at the Catholic Church, all that work across the decades on liberation theology and base Christian communities, but equally well the sort of radical social change wings of other faiths are absolutely at the heart of community organizing in many of its expressions. There are also grassroots social movements which are clearly very, very adjacent, overlapping to community organizing. In the US, groups like the Self-Employed Women's Association or the slum dwellers movements in many countries, or the indigenous rights movements around the world. So how does organizing differ from other forms of activism? And here I'm drawing on the ideas of Marshall Gantz at Harvard, who has been doing community organizing for half a century. He dropped out of Harvard originally to go and work with the civil rights movement and the land workers in California. So he's both a scholar and a superb activist. So if you do ever get a chance to meet him, please go or read his books. He is a fount of wisdom. He says activism focuses on the what, raising awareness, organizing events, lobbying, that's fine. But community organizing works on the how. All of these things need to build the power of communities to act for themselves and build the leadership they need to do that. Mobilizing is a tactic. Mobilizing is about getting people out on the street in large numbers to demonstrate to decision makers that people care. That's fine, but organizing is a much deeper strategy based on building power. Advocacy, he's rather dismissive of advocacy. I'm not nearly as dismissive as that because I guess I've done more of it than I have community organizing. But for him, advocacy is experts lobbying in the corridors of power for change. Organizing is building people power to win systemic change, deeper change. It's not about tweaking a law or tweaking a budget. It's about building power to really work for a new society. But there are overlaps. So just just a simple way of explaining things. Organizing would be people like the Industrial Areas Foundation or Citizens UK, who I've mentioned. Advocacy would be things like litigation, taking that recent case to the International Court of Justice on climate change, which was quite influential. Mobilization would be Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, or most recently Palestine Action. But there are overlaps. So Black Lives Matter clearly did a lot of very, very profound organizing, but it also did a lot of mobilization. The Living Wage campaign in the UK grew out of citizens, but it actually became an advocacy campaign as well. And there was quite a tension between its commitment to organizing and its commitment to actually winning laws and changes in policy on the living wage. International NGOs like Oxfam, where I used to work, quite happy doing advocacy, but they also do public campaigning and mobilizing. And then the civil rights movement, that iconic example, did all three. Key aspect of community organizing is the ability to read the room. This is not about being right. It's not about writing the ultimate research paper, having all the statistics. It's about sensing where people are at, what makes them angry, when they might stand up. And there's some lovely examples in the literature. The literature on community organizing is some of the most moving and beautiful that I've read on activism about, in this case, singing. Singing was an embodiment of that love in the civil rights movement in the US. You won't read phrases like that in most of the manuals for advocacy. But organizing does engage the state, whether it's at national level or local level. And there what you get is a sense of tension. You want relationships, but you're not trying to be their best friend. You want to be close enough to pressure them, but also to resist co-optation. And that's from Ed Chambers, one of the founders of the Industrial Areas Foundation in the US. It holds officials accountable publicly, trains local leaders to run for office if necessary. And the picture on the slide is from some fantastic work by Citizens UK, which I was lucky enough to witness during UK election campaigns at national or at London level and other cities now. They would bring together thousands of people from the most disadvantaged communities in the UK to listen and hold to account candidates in big elections, and they came and they listened, and it was a superb example of what community organizing can achieve. Community organizing also targets changing social norms. The very act of organizing changes social norms in that it shifts who people see as leaders. It elevates the voices of those leaders and of the communities of which they are part. It reshapes the perceptions of other groups about those communities. And I've given examples on We Can, working on violence against women in South Asia, but also a superb book by Harry Hahn, another of the gurus of community organizing in terms of scholarship, about a campaign in Cincinnati, Ohio, which won a tax rise to support education for Black kids in the middle of a swing to the Trump campaign. And it was all run by a large mega church in Cincinnati. Finally, a nuanced conversation about the use of digital. in community organizing. It's obviously useful for amplification, for getting messages out really quickly, for bringing people in. But it's not always effective at building those long-term deep relationships. So although it was initially seen as a shortcut to numbers and victory, now the most effective community organizers are combining online mobilization with offline. And I think that's a very sensible attempt to get the best of both worlds.